In Daniel 5, God judged Babylon, but first he sent a warning as writing on the wall. In Revelation, we have a warning of the judgment of Mystery Babylon, which is Israel. The purpose of a warning is to avert disaster. So we're looking at the calamities prophesied for Israel in the hope they can be saved out of them by Christ, the only way of salvation. Let's look at some of the future calamities prophesied for Israel. In Zechariah 14 we read, "I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, half of the city shall go into captivity." This is at the time the Mount of Olives splits in two. It hasn't happened yet. And from Zechariah 12, from the Greek Septuagint version, we read, "I will make Jerusalem a trodden stone to all the nations. Everyone that tramples on it shall utterly mock at it, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it." Again, this is also yet to happen. Some more prophecies of the coming doom for Israel. The question was asked in Daniel 12, how long until the end of the wonders of the vision, which included the raising of the dead? And the answer was, when the power of the holy people, meaning Israel, has finally been shattered, all these things will be complete. Then there's the two witnesses of Revelation 11 who represent Judah and Israel. They're victorious for a while, but when the two witnesses have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will wage war with them and will overpower and kill them. And my last quote is about the little horn of the beast of Daniel 8, the same beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that's in Revelation 11, the end-time power that attacks Israel. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. This horn was waging war against the holy ones and prevailing. Again we have the trampling underfoot of Israel. Why is this judgment coming on them? Let's go back and think about the judgment of the original Babylon. Belshazzar was feasting with 1,000 of his lords, misusing the gold and silver vessels of the temple. And then a hand appeared, writing the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Daniel was called in to interpret the meaning, which he did. Neo-Babylon, a great empire that lasted 70 years, was about to end. Daniel interpreted a meaning for Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. It went, Mene, God has measured your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, it has been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided, meaning taken off you, finished. But these words that Daniel interpreted already had a meaning to the people of the day. Tekel was simply a shekel. A Babylonian mene was a weight of 50 shekels, not to be confused with the Jewish temple mene that was 60 shekels, and a parsin was half a mene. They were weights used for money and trade. We can even add up the value. It came to 126 shekels. We'll see the meaning for this later. Daniel, in the interpretation, used the verb form of each word, which meant measured, measured, weighed, divided. And God applies the same symbols to Israel. She also gets measured, weighed, and divided. And we're going to see in ancient prophecies that the language that was once applied to Babylon gets applied to Israel. And once again, the writing is on the wall. God is appealing to Israel to understand where they went wrong and do something about it. In Revelation 11, God measures Israel by measuring the temple and those in it. Israel are called 2 witnesses because they were split into 2 parts, Israel and Judah. I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, Go and measure the temple of God and the altar and its worshippers. I will empower my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. This is similar language to Jeremiah 11, where Israel and Judah are 2 witnesses who are judged as evil. Let's read it. What is my beloved doing in my temple, as she with many others work out her evil schemes? The Lord called you a thriving olive tree. The Lord Almighty who planted you has decreed disaster for you, because the people of both Israel and Judah have done evil. So just as Babylon was measured, so is Israel. She also gets weighed. This happens in Zechariah 5. She is weighed in a measuring basket, an ephah. Let's read about it. A measuring basket is going forth. Then he continued, This is their iniquity in all the land. And behold, the cover of lead was raised, and there was a woman sitting inside the measure. This is wickedness, he said, and he shoved her down into the measure, pushing down the lead cover over its opening. Where are they taking the measure? I asked the angel. To build a house for it in the land of Shinar, which is Babylon, he told me. This is the prophecy where Israel becomes Mystery Babylon. It was written when the returned exiles were restoring the temple. But why was Zechariah talking to them about the wickedness in the land going to Babylon? Because they didn't ever get things right when they returned. The highlight of Ezra and Nehemiah after their return is their exclusion of foreigners, and that's what Zechariah preached against. This prophecy was written in the 2nd year of Darius. In the 4th year, he said, But they refused to pay attention. Stubbornly they turned their backs and covered their ears. They made their hearts as hard as flint and would not listen to the law or to the words that the Lord Almighty had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. So even though the Jews had returned from Babylon, God considered them still part of Babylon. These words were written in the 4th year of Darius, and the temple was completed soon after. But Zechariah kept telling them God wanted a different temple, a house for all nations. Revelation 17 picks up the same theme of the wicked woman who gets judged. I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. She held a gold cup in her hand, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So all the elements of the original Babylon are here. Babylon, someone holding a golden cup, and judgment. We can find the interpretation for Israel as the harlot of Babylon in Ezekiel 16, a message to Israel. Your fame spread among the nations. You increased your harlotry to include Babylonia, a land of merchants. But even with this you are not satisfied. I am filled with fury against you, acting like a brazen harlot. So, Israel the harlot caught up in Babylon, a land of merchants. The description of how the harlot of Revelation was clothed is like the furnishings of the temple and garments of the high priest. Let's compare them. In Revelation 17 we read, The woman, harlot, was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. And Ezekiel 16 tells us, talking about Israel, I dressed you in fine linen and covered you with costly garments. I adorned you with jewelry. Very similar language. And there's more clues that the harlot is Israel. Verse 6 tells us the harlot was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore witness to Jesus. So who bore witness to Jesus? Not just those who came after, but those before his time as well. Acts tells us that all the prophets bore witness to Jesus. in chapter 10. To him all the prophets bear witness. And Jeremiah tells us that Israel killed the prophets in chapter 2. Your sword has devoured your prophets like a ravenous lion. Also in Acts we read, was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, and now you have betrayed and murdered him. And finally in Matthew 23, Jesus said, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. The next piece of the puzzle in identifying the harlot as Israel takes us to her location. Let's read Revelation 17. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. And we know that Israel sat on the land of 7 nations God gave them. Acts, Deuteronomy, and Joshua all say that God gave Israel 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Acts 13, and he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. And then there's also the promise of the land of 10 nations to Abraham. To your descendants I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, and he lists 10 nations. When Israel failed God, he told Israel, the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes. So here we have the land of 7 and 10 where the woman sits. There's another identifying feature of the harlot. We read of it in verse 18. The woman you saw is the great city having kingship over the kings of the earth. This is a really bad translation. It should read, the woman you saw is the great city having kingship among the kings of the earth, which is exactly what Israel has. She's a trading nation like those around her, but not the light to the Gentiles. She never left Babylon. So here we have a picture of Israel, Mystery Babylon, sitting on a strange beast. In fact, she became like that beast, and ultimately the final head of the beast, along with the 10 horns, will attack her. In Revelation 18, we read of the judgment of the city of Babylon, which the harlot is caught up in. Its judgment is very quick. And verse 10 says, in 1 hour your judgment has come. Sort of an echo of the quick judgment of the original Babylon. That very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. The city is cast like a stone into the sea. We read, a mighty angel picked up a stone the size of a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, with such violence the great city of Babylon will be cast down. Notice it's a specific prophecy about Babylon, not the whole world. The onlookers witness it. They are themselves pretty bad, but it's not their demise. Let's keep reading. The kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail at the sight of the smoke rising from the fire that consumes her. Mystery Babylon sinking into the sea echoes ancient Babylon also sinking. Let's read about it in Jeremiah 51. When you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and cast it into the Euphrates. Then you are to say, in the same way Babylon will sink and never rise again because of the disaster I will bring upon her. And yet, It's interesting that we read in Revelation 16 that the Euphrates River dries up where this ancient scroll of Jeremiah's was once thrown. So what happens to the scroll and the stone? It's seen again, and it seems like the old prophecies of Jeremiah have a second fulfillment in Revelation. So that's how Israel became Babylon. But she has many titles, all appeals from God to understand what they became and to change. She's the two witnesses who are destroyed by the beast of the abyss, who can call fire from heaven. She's the beast of the earth, who can also call fire from heaven. And the man of lawlessness Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians. Because Israel became Babylon, she was not only the harlot, but in the same category as the other beast kingdoms, and she becomes the beast of the earth of Revelation 13. I saw another beast rising out of the earth, which is the promised land. This beast had two horns like a lamb, the horns being Judah and Israel, but spoke like a dragon. Here is a call for wisdom. Let the one who has insight calculate or count the number of the beast, for it is the number of humanity, and that number is 666. This beast appears at the same time as the other beast which rises out of the sea or the abyss, which has 7 heads and 10 crowned horns, but it's a separate beast, and we can count its number. It's another Mene Tekel Parsin for measuring Israel. We can count the number of the beast by the years they were under foreign or beast rule while they were in the land. We don't include their self-rule or when they were scattered or the time now when they have self-rule in the land. Only their time under foreign rule, which began in 609 BC when Egypt made Judah a client state. This was followed by the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks. Then Israel self-ruled under the Hasmonean kingdom, which we don't count. And then the Romans ruled them before they were finally scattered in 135 CE. Adding that time under foreign rule in their land up, we get 666 years. Israel's time under beast or foreign rule. And that is how we add up or count the number of the beast. The more you look, the more you see, and it's really interesting that the symbols for Babylon get applied to Mystery Babylon and expanded. For example, the image of Babylon, which Nebuchadnezzar set up, measured 60 by 6. Mystery Babylon, the beast, has the number 660 and 6. Jeremiah told us there would be 70 years for Babylon. Daniel 9 tells us that Mystery Babylon, Israel, gets 70 by 7 years, 77s. The Mene Tekel Parsin for Babylon added up to 126. In Revelation, we find that number becomes 1,260 for Mystery Babylon, which is Israel. Let's see how that works. Daniel was given a prophecy that 77s would pass over Israel until all things were completed. The time was divided into 7 sevens, 62 sevens, and 1 7, a total of 490 years. It began in 457 BC when Artaxerxes told Ezra to return and build up Jerusalem. It was a prophecy that predicted the anointing of Christ at the start of the last 7, and Jesus referred to this time when he began his ministry in 27 AD by declaring, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of heaven is at hand." In the middle of the final 7, Jesus was killed. He became the Passover lamb. But the Jews failed to recognize their Messiah. So the final 3.5 years became a representative time. Described in Revelation as 1,260 days or 42 months, or a time, times, and half a time, all pointing back to the 3.5-year witness of Jesus that was rejected. It's kind of like the 40 years in the wilderness pointing back to the 40 days of spying out the promised land that was rejected. And so it is that we read in Revelation 12 of a woman clothed with all the lights of heaven, being the Christians, who's in the wilderness for 1,260 days. And this time period is also called a time, times, and half a time, showing how it's representative. Also, the two witnesses of Revelation 11, who are Israel and Judah, are clothed in sackcloth for 1,260 days, because it's all pointing to this same thing. And it seems to me that there's a literal 3.5-year witness of the beast of the abyss, the antithesis of the Lamb, being the beast, who witnesses for 42 months. It's actually this beast, along with the 10 horns, who attacks Israel and defeats her. We read in Revelation 17, "The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the harlot. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire." This is the coming battle when Israel no longer has the upper hand. And then we come to the parson part of the writing on the wall, the kingdom taken away and given to others. Jesus said to the Jewish leaders, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit." Those producing the fruit are the Christians, those who follow Christ. And so, because the Jews rejected their Messiah and failed to produce the fruit of the gospel, the kingdom of God was taken away from them. Rejected, who would take the right message to the ends of the earth. But God still wants the Jews back. Reading in Romans 11:25, "A hardening in part has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved." So all who turn to Jesus will be saved, including Jews, but they must become Christians. All Israel doesn't mean all Jews. It means all who are spiritual Israel, as God intended from the beginning of the nation. A good example of this is found in Revelation 7, which shows that God always intended Israel to be made of people from every nation, tongue, and tribe. So in verse 4 we read that John heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. But then a couple of verses later, he saw what he'd heard about. "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tongue, people, and tribe, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes." These two passages are talking about exactly the same thing. It's called an emblematic parallelism. First we have the symbol, and the symbol is actually Israel, consisting of 144,000 from all the tribes. But the literal is people from every nation, tongue, and tribe. So Revelation spells out clearly for those who see it that is the message God always wanted: children born not of natural descent, nor of a human decision or husband's will, but born of God, as we're told in John 1:13. God always wanted people from every nation, and that was always his intention for Israel. But even though this coming attack is prophesied, it's not unchangeable, as Joel 2 says. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart. Say, spare your people, Lord. Do not make your inheritance an object of scorn, a byword among the nations. The plea is, turn to God. Don't rely on being Jewish. That won't save you. We're saved by turning to Jesus, the true Passover lamb. If you've found this helpful, you can find further studies on my blog at this link.